Do you remember when entertainment demanded something from you? The Victorians certainly did. They dressed dead kittens in tiny clothes and posed them at tea parties. They melted toxic lead at parties, unknowingly poisoning themselves while trying to glimpse their future husbands. And that's only the beginning. Seaweed scrapbooking. Victorian seaweed scrapbooking transformed humble ocean vegetation into genuine works of beauty. Collectors would wade into tide pools, carefully selecting specimens with the most graceful shapes, the most intriguing textures, the most unusual colors. Back home, they pressed these treasures between absorbent papers, waiting patiently for days as moisture released and forms flattened. Then came the real craft, arranging dried seaweed onto construction paper, creating elaborate designs that spelled out names, formed decorative wreaths, or mimicked the flowing patterns of the underwater gardens from which they came. The hobby emerged from the Victorian obsession with cataloguing nature, with possessing pieces of the natural world and displaying them as proof of cultured sensibility. Queen Victoria herself reportedly kept a seaweed scrapbook during her youth, which tells you everything about how respectable this pursuit became. Guidebooks appeared, teaching enthusiasts how to identify different algae species, how to preserve specimens properly, how to achieve the most elegant compositions. Today, most of us walk past seaweed on the beach without pausing, perhaps wrinkling our noses at the briny smell of decomposition. We photograph ocean views for Instagram rather than bringing pieces of the sea home in our pockets. But there was something lovely about this hands-on engagement with nature, this patience required to create beauty from materials others considered worthless. Have you ever looked at something ordinary and seen the potential for art hidden within it? Terrarium building. Close your eyes and imagine London in the 1850s. The air tastes of sulfur and ash. Coal smoke from thousands of chimneys creates a perpetual haze that stains buildings black and burns your throat with every breath. You've tried growing ferns in your parlour, those delicate green fronds that remind you of countryside visits, but they wither and brown within weeks. The very air of the city is killing them, and you realize with a chill that you're breathing that same poisonous atmosphere every moment of every day. Then you discover the Wardian case, a sealed glass enclosure named for botanist Nathaniel Ward, who stumbled upon the concept while trying to preserve a moth pupa. Inside that glass, plants thrive. Protected from the toxic city air, they create their own tiny ecosystem, cycling moisture in an endless rain that never falls beyond the container's walls. You can finally have living green in your home, even if it requires sealing nature away from the world outside your windows. Victorian terrariums began as a practical solution to urban pollution so severe that vegetation couldn't survive exposure to open air. Think about that for a moment. The atmosphere in major cities was so contaminated that people needed sealed glass containers just to keep houseplants alive. The same air filling their lungs, entering their children's bedrooms, saturating their clothes with its chemical stench. But from that grim necessity, genuine beauty emerged. Terrariums grew from tabletop curiosities to room-sized installations. Gardeners experimented with exotic plants, shipped across oceans in protective Wardian cases, the same technology that kept parlour ferns alive, enabling the global plant trade. Today, terrariums have experienced a renaissance among urban dwellers, craving connection with nature. But we've forgotten their origin story, the desperate ingenuity of people trying to maintain something green and growing in a world their own industry was poisoning. Does your home contain any living plants? And have you ever considered what it would mean if the air itself couldn't support them? The secret language of flowers. Picture receiving a bouquet from a suitor, the blooms carefully arranged, the colors deliberately chosen. Your heart races as you carry them inside, but not because of their beauty alone. You reach for your flower dictionary, that well-thumbed reference book every respectable Victorian household possessed, and begin decoding the message hidden in petals and stems. What secrets has your admirer literally handed you? The Victorian language of flowers transformed simple bouquets into encrypted correspondence. Every bloom carried meaning. Red roses spoke of passionate love, yes, but that was only the beginning. Oleanders whispered warnings of vengeance to come. Hydrangeas accused the receiver of heartlessness. Combinations of flowers could construct entire sentences, declarations of devotion, or accusations of betrayal wrapped in innocent-looking arrangements. Young people navigating courtship under the watchful eyes of chaperones found in flowers a method of communication that bypassed spoken words entirely. A gentleman could declare intentions he'd never be permitted to voice aloud. A lady could respond with encouragement or rejection that maintained perfect propriety while conveying unmistakable meaning. The system became so elaborate that multiple flower dictionaries competed in the marketplace, sometimes assigning different meanings to the same blooms, adding an extra layer of potential miscommunication to already complicated romantic negotiations. Today, we send flowers as generic gestures of affection or sympathy, rarely considering whether the specific blooms carry any significance. A dozen red roses means love, we vaguely understand. But the rest of the vocabulary has been lost. We've traded a rich symbolic language for convenience, emoji hearts replacing carefully chosen carnations. But imagine the thrill of receiving a bouquet that required decoding, of knowing that someone had studied and selected each flower with intention. When was the last time you received a gift that communicated something beyond its obvious purpose? Collecting the natural world. Walk into a fashionable Victorian parlour and your eyes might not know where to land first. Butterflies pinned under glass, bird eggs nested in cotton-lined boxes, fossils arranged on mantels, pressed flowers filling albums, beetles mounted on boards, seashells cascading from display cases. The effect resembles a natural history museum exploding inside a residential home, and to Victorian sensibilities, this chaos represented the height of cultured living. The hobby of natural history collecting transformed ordinary citizens into amateur scientists, participants in the great project of cataloguing and understanding the natural world. Darwin's theories had ignited public imagination. Explorers returned from distant continents with specimens of creatures previously unknown to Western science. The entire planet seemed newly available for examination, and people wanted to own pieces of that expanding knowledge. Beatrix Potter, before she created Peter Rabbit, produced natural history illustrations of remarkable scientific accuracy. She painted lizards, mushrooms, bats, and fungi with the precision of a trained naturalist, treating no subject as too humble for careful observation. Her specimens filled notebooks that earned respect from actual scientists, not merely amateur appreciation. Modern homes rarely contain such collections. We've outsourced natural history to museums and documentaries, experiencing nature through screens rather than specimens. Our parents' generation might remember childhood collections of leaves or rocks, the satisfaction of organizing and displaying treasures gathered from the natural world. But most children today collect digital items rather than physical ones, Pokémon rather than pressed flowers. Have you ever held a fossil in your hands, felt the impossible weight of time contained in stone, and understood why Victorians found such objects irresistible? Crystal gazing. The room is dark, lit only by candles positioned to avoid reflecting in the polished sphere before you. You've waited for the proper astronomical conditions, the sun at its northernmost declination, the moment when the veil between worlds supposedly grows thin. Your crystal ball, purchased at considerable expense and cleaned according to precise ritual instructions, sits on its velvet cushion. You breathe slowly, letting your eyes unfocus, waiting for the images that might appear in those glassy depths. Crystal gazing captivated Victorian imaginations with its promise of glimpsing futures that ordinary sight couldn't perceive. The hobby came wrapped in elaborate rituals, specific rules governing everything from session timing to proper ball maintenance. Practitioners developed detailed mythologies around their crystals, some claiming ancient Egyptian origins, others connecting the practice to biblical prophets who supposedly used similar methods to receive divine visions. The appeal seems contradictory for an era that also embraced unprecedented scientific advancement. But Victorians contained multitudes. The same society that produced Darwin and Industrial Revolution found room for spiritualism and the occult. Perhaps the rapid pace of change made people hungry for certainty about futures that seemed increasingly unpredictable. Perhaps the rigid social hierarchies of the era made magical thinking appealing to those who couldn't change their circumstances through conventional means. Today, fortune-telling persists in newspaper horoscopes, phone psychics, and tarot card readers operating in strip mall storefronts. But the elaborate ritual surrounding Victorian crystal gazing has largely vanished, replaced by quicker, less demanding forms of divination. We want to know our futures, but we're no longer willing to wait for proper celestial alignments or follow complex preparatory procedures. Do you ever wonder what's coming, and what methods have you used to try glimpsing ahead? True crime recreation. Imagine sitting in your Victorian parlour holding a tiny earthenware model of a murder scene. The Red Barn stretches before you in miniature, every detail of the notorious crime site rendered in ceramic. You know the story. Everyone does. William Corder shot Maria Martin in that barn, buried her body beneath its floor, and might have escaped justice entirely if Maria's mother hadn't dreamed the location of her daughter's grave. Now you hold the scene in your hands, examining it from angles the actual investigators never could. Playing detective from the safety of your armchair. True crime obsession didn't begin with podcasts or Netflix documentaries. The Victorians pioneered the phenomenon, purchasing miniature recreations of famous crime scenes and treating them as both entertainment and intellectual puzzle. These ceramic dioramas came complete with commemorative mugs bearing criminals' faces, an entire merchandise ecosystem surrounding notorious murders that would feel familiar to modern true crime enthusiasts. The hobby satisfied the same impulses that drew readers to Sherlock Holmes, that fundamental human fascination with understanding how evil operates, how detectives piece together evidence, how justice eventually arrives. Victorians couldn't binge-watch crime shows, so they collected crime scenes instead, building personal museums of notorious delinquency. Today, we consume true crime content through podcasts heard during commutes, documentaries watched in bed, YouTube videos playing while we cook dinner. The medium has changed entirely, but the appetite remains identical. We still want to understand criminals, still want to play detective, still find ourselves drawn to tragedy, even when we know we should look away. What true crime story has captured your attention, and what do you think draws you to such darkness? Freak show attendance. The tent smells of sawdust and sweat. You've paid your admission, joining crowds pressing toward the stage, where a man with severe physical deformities will soon appear. The barker calls him the Elephant Man, though his name is Joseph Merrick, a detail most spectators neither know nor care about. You tell yourself you're here out of scientific curiosity, a desire to understand the varieties of human form, but something else brings you to this tent. Something harder to admit. Victorian freak shows displayed human beings with unusual physical conditions for paying audiences. Bearded women, conjoined twins, individuals with gigantism, dwarfism, hypertrichosis, and dozens of other conditions paraded before crowds who paid to gawk. The term freak itself entered common usage during the 1840s, shorthand for freak of nature, vocabulary that reveals everything about how Victorian society viewed human difference. The hobby intersected uncomfortably with genuine scientific interest. Some physicians attended seeking to understand the medical conditions on display, but for most spectators, the experience was simply entertainment, difference transformed into spectacle without meaningful engagement or recognition of shared humanity. Modern sensibilities rightfully recoil from such exhibitions, yet disabled advocates have noted the complexity involved. Before social safety nets and disability accommodations, freak shows provided one of the few income sources available to people whose conditions prevented conventional employment. Exploitation and economic survival tangled together inextricably. We like to imagine we've progressed beyond such crude entertainment, but reality television often traffics in similar impulses, displaying unusual bodies and behaviors for audience fascination. The packaging has become more polished, but have the underlying appetites truly changed? What draws you to watch people whose lives differ dramatically from your own? Hair jewelry. You clasp the brooch at your throat, feeling its familiar weight against your collar. Inside the ornate gold setting lies a carefully woven lock of your mother's hair, the chestnut strands she cut for you before the consumption took her last spring. Every time you touch this jewelry, you touch her. Every time you look at your reflection, you see her presence woven into your appearance. She is gone, but she is also here, literally wrapped around your body. Hair jewellery allowed Victorians to carry their loved ones with them always. Locks of hair were woven, braided, and shaped into brooches, earrings, bracelets, watch fobs, and rings. The craft required genuine skill, transforming raw hair into intricate patterns that could be set in precious metal settings and worn for decades. The trend exploded during the American Civil War, when hundreds of thousands of families suddenly mourned. Men who might never receive proper burials, whose bodies might never return home. Hair cut before departure could be worn against grieving hearts, physical proof that the lost soldier had once existed, had once been real and warm and present. Not all hair jewellery commemorated the dead. Friends exchanged locks as tokens of affection. Wives wove their own hair into watch fobs that husbands carried to work, keeping spouses symbolically close during daily separation. The practice expressed devotion through material presence, not just sentiment, but actual physical substance of the beloved person. Today, we photograph constantly, but rarely keep physical tokens of those we love. We carry thousands of digital images, but nothing that once grew from a loved one's body. The Victorian practice seems morbid to modern sensibilities, but consider what they understood that we might have forgotten. Photographs fade and corrupt. Hair, properly preserved, endures. Have you kept any physical token of someone you've lost? And what does it mean to hold something that once was part of them? Seances and spirit communication. The room falls silent as you join hands around the table. Candles flicker, casting shadows that seem to move with intention. The medium closes her eyes, her breathing deepening, her voice changing as she calls out to spirits who might be listening. You're skeptical, of course, but your mother died last winter, and the thought that you might hear her voice again, might receive some message from beyond the grave, has brought you to this darkened parlour despite your doubts. Spiritualism exploded across Victorian society like a religious revival, claiming perhaps 11 million adherents at its height. Seances became regular social gatherings in respectable homes, as common as dinner parties or afternoon teas. Everyone attended at least one, from Queen Victoria seeking communication with her beloved Albert to Mark Twain satisfying literary curiosity. The movement began with teenage sisters Margaret and Kate Fox, who claimed that mysterious tapping sounds in their New York home came from spirits communicating in code. They attracted celebrity believers, built careers as professional mediums, and eventually confessed they'd faked everything. But their admission barely dented spiritualist conviction. True believers simply dismissed the confession as coerced or false. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, creator of the supremely rational Sherlock Holmes, remained devoted to spiritualism throughout his life, believing passionately that the dead could communicate with the living. The contradiction between his fictional detective's rigorous logic and his personal embrace of unverifiable supernatural claims seemingly never troubled him. Today, mediums still claim to channel the dead, appearing on television and filling auditoriums. Grief makes us vulnerable to anyone promising connection with those we've lost. The deep human need to believe death isn't final transcends eras and evidence. Have you ever wished you could communicate with someone who's died? And what would you say if you believed they could hear? Cemetery picnicking. Spread your blanket on the grass between headstones. Unpack your basket of ginger snaps and cold beef sandwiches. The children run ahead, playing among the monuments, while you settle into conversation with your sister, both of you keeping one eye on the stone that marks your mother's resting place. This is your Sunday afternoon, and it feels perfectly normal. The dead don't mind your company. In fact, being near them seems to honor their memory more than leaving them in lonely silence. Victorian cemeteries functioned as the era's public parks. Before city planning prioritized green spaces for urban populations, burial grounds offered the only sprawling lawns, mature trees, and peaceful atmospheres available to ordinary citizens. People flocked to them not despite the graves, but because cemeteries were often the only beautiful outdoor spaces accessible to the public. Greenwood Cemetery in New York attracted 500,000 visitors annually by the 1850s, making it the state's second most popular destination after Niagara Falls. Families picnicked among the tombstones, couples strolled along winding paths, children played where the dead slept undisturbed below. This comfort with proximity to death reflected daily reality for Victorians. Cholera, yellow fever, tuberculosis, and countless other diseases claimed lives constantly. Childhood mortality remained devastatingly high. Women died regularly in childbirth. Every family knew loss intimately, visited graves frequently, lived with death as constant companion rather than distant abstraction. Modern cemeteries discourage such casual visitation, and most of us only enter them for funerals or obligatory memorial visits. We've pushed death to the margins of life, hidden it in hospitals and nursing homes, sanitized it into something that happens elsewhere to other people until suddenly it doesn't. When did you last visit a cemetery, and how did it feel to stand among the dead? Lead-pouring fortune games. Your hands tremble slightly as you hold the ladle over the flame, watching the grey metal slowly liquefy. The other girls crowd close, giggling with nervous excitement, each waiting her turn to glimpse her romantic future. When the lead melts completely, you pour it through the hole in a large key, watching it splash into cold water below. Steam rises with a hiss. You fish out the solidified metal and examine its shape, searching for hints about the man you'll someday marry. Victorian Halloween parties featured this game prominently, especially among young unmarried women for whom marriage represented life's most important milestone. The melted lead formed random shapes that players interpreted like tea leaves, seeking occupational symbols or character indicators that might preview future husbands. The obvious problem, which Victorian players didn't understand, was the lead itself. Melting lead releases toxic fumes that cause anemia, weakness, kidney damage, and brain damage. Players poisoned themselves annually, inhaling neurotoxins while trying to glimpse romantic futures they might not live to experience due to the very game they were playing. Today, we understand lead's dangers so thoroughly that we've removed it from paint, gasoline, and water pipes. The thought of deliberately melting lead in enclosed spaces and breathing the fumes seems unthinkably reckless. But the Victorians didn't know. They couldn't know. They were gambling with their health in pursuit of knowledge about love, a risk that seems tragic precisely because it was unknowing. What risks have you taken for love, and how many of them seemed perfectly safe at the time? The marriage and divorce game. You line up against the parlor wall with the other girls, suddenly self-conscious about your dress, your hair, the slight flush creeping up your neck. Across the room, young men arrange themselves in a corresponding line. You have no idea who stands directly opposite you, whether it's the charming banker's son you've been hoping to meet, or the awkward clerk who laughs too loudly at his own jokes. When the music stops, you'll be partnered with whoever fate has positioned across from you. And then the real game begins. Victorian parlour games frequently involved public evaluation and judgment that modern sensibilities would find unbearable. The marriage and divorce game forced random pairs to write character sketches of each other on the spot, roasting their assigned partners based on first impressions, then reading those assessments aloud to the assembled group. A designated judge then ridiculed the couple publicly before deciding whether they should remain married within the game or be granted a divorce. The entertainment came from watching strangers critique each other, seeing discomfort play across faces, hearing assessments that might sting more than anyone expected. Couples who requested divorce, despite the judge deeming them compatible, faced forfeit penalties, adding financial stakes to social humiliation. The game reveals something uncomfortable about Victorian entertainment. The same culture famous for elaborate etiquette and careful propriety found amusement in formalized public embarrassment. Perhaps the rigid social rules made such release necessary. Perhaps the pressure to conform made watching others squirm under judgment cathartic. Modern dating apps involve their own forms of snap judgment and rejection, though we deliver them privately, through swipes rather than public pronouncements. Have we really become kinder, or have we just found ways to be cruel in private rather than in parlours? Playing funeral. The doll lies still in its tiny coffin, button eyes, staring at nothing. Your daughter arranged flowers around the box, borrowed from the garden without permission, but you haven't the heart to scold her. She stands at the head of the impromptu grave, speaking solemn words she's heard the ministers say over real caskets. The other children bow their heads, playing their parts as mourners. When she finishes, they'll process to the corner of the garden for burial. then likely dig up the doll tomorrow to do it all again. Victorian children played funeral with their dolls regularly enough that toy manufacturers included mourning accessories as standard additions to doll wardrobes. Tiny black dresses and miniature coffins sat alongside tea party outfits and everyday clothes. Parents watching their daughters officiate last rites felt pride rather than concern, viewing the play as healthy preparation for inevitable losses. Charles Dickens mentioned the phenomenon in his 1840 novel, The Old Curiosity Shop, presenting a scene of children playing funeral in a graveyard as atmospheric rather than alarming. The image disturbs modern readers, but Dickens treated it as unremarkable, a natural part of childhood in a world where death visited families constantly. Today, parents discovering their children conducting doll funerals would likely consult child psychologists. We've pushed death so far from childhood experience that playing at it seems pathological rather than preparatory. But Victorian children weren't morbid. They were practicing for realities they would certainly face, normalizing rituals they would someday perform in earnest. How did you first encounter death as a child? Post-mortem photography. The photographer arranges your family carefully around the chair where your brother sits. He looks peaceful, eyes closed as if sleeping. The flush that tuberculosis gave his cheeks still visible, though his chest no longer rises with breath. The exposure will take several minutes. You must all hold perfectly still. But your brother, for the first time in months, needs no reminding to remain motionless. Victorians photographed their dead. Entire families posed formally alongside recently deceased loved ones, creating images that served as both memorial and memento mori. Photographers developed techniques for making corpses appear lifelike, sometimes propping eyes open, sometimes positioning bodies as if merely sleeping, sometimes adding color through hand tinting to suggest living vitality. The practice emerged from practical circumstances. Photography remained expensive and required special occasions to justify the cost. Many children died before families arranged formal portraits. For some, post-mortem photographs became the only images ever taken. Precious records proving that brief lives had existed, that small hands had once been held, that little voices had once filled nurseries now silent. Modern viewers find these images disturbing, even ghoulish, but context matters. Victorian families experienced death differently than we do. They washed bodies at home, held wakes in parlors, buried their dead in nearby churchyards. Death happened among the living rather than behind hospital doors. Photographing the deceased extended natural intimacy rather than violating taboos that didn't yet exist. We take thousands of photographs of the living, but rarely photograph the dead. Have we gained something in that shift, or have we lost a form of honoring and remembering that earlier generations understood? Anthropomorphic taxidermy. Step into the parlor and let your eyes adjust to what they're seeing. On the side table, beneath a glass dome, a group of taxidermied kittens sits around a tiny table having tea. They're dressed in elaborate miniature clothing, paws positioned to hold cups and saucers, glass eyes staring into middle distance as if frozen mid-conversation. On the mantel, another scene depicts taxidermied mice attending a wedding. The bride in a white dress, the groom in a tiny suit, guests looking on with expressions their faces never wore in life. Anthropomorphic taxidermy combined two Victorian obsessions into something greater than either component. Natural history provided the specimens, the preserved bodies of animals that could be positioned and displayed. Whimsical imagination provided the scenarios, transforming dead creatures into actors in frozen theatrical productions, depicting recognizably human activities. The hobby required genuine skill. Hermann Pluquet, a German taxidermist working for the Royal Museum in Stuttgart, elevated the craft to an art form that impressed Charlotte Bronte and earned praise from Queen Victoria herself. His scenes demonstrated anatomical knowledge, artistic sensibility, and countless hours of meticulous labor, all in service of positioning deceased animals at tiny furniture. The results disturb modern viewers in ways that purely scientific taxidermy doesn't. Mounting a deer head on a wall seems unremarkable. Dressing dead kittens in clothes and posing them at tea parties crosses into territory that feels fundamentally wrong, a violation of something we struggle to name. Yet, Victorians displayed these scenes proudly in their homes, conversation pieces for visitors, evidence of cultured sensibility and appreciation for both nature and whimsy. They saw nothing disturbing in dead animals dressed as people, frozen in eternal pantomimes of domestic life. What does this tell us about them? What does our discomfort tell us about ourselves? The Victorians lived in a world we can barely imagine, a world where death visited constantly, where entertainment demanded effort, where people found beauty and meaning in pursuits we now consider bizarre. They pressed seaweed and built terrariums, decoded flower messages, and collected butterflies. They poured toxic metal to glimpse their romantic futures and played games of public humiliation in candlelit parlors. They photographed their dead, dressed in mourning for years, wore jewelry made from the hair of loved ones they'd lost. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed watching this video, click on one of the boxes playing on your screen to watch more similar content.